freedom of expression, we want to get educated from our panelists that how the creative artists, the people who use creative arts for their expression, how do they balance the two things, freedom of expression and conditions applied by the state on these expressions. And also closely associated is the question of hate speech. When we talk about hate speech, in US, for example, First Amendment, after the First Amendment, there is an understanding that even hate speech is a form of expression, and it should not be limited. In the context of Pakistan or in some other countries, states can also create environments which limit your freedoms. So I will like to get educated on this from my eminent panelists.
Being in Pakistan, one is always aware of the conflicts that have arisen between freedom of expression and not only the state control, but also the hate speech that comes from intolerant and extremist people in society. And I know that it may be, I'm a journalist, so I have to deal with this on a day-to-day basis, and I understand how difficult it is to say the things that you want to say. Freedom of expression is conditioned by the environment of a society. Religion has become an issue for Pakistan and some other parts of South Asia also, where it totally blocks your expression, because you cannot have a rational debate. And if you cannot have a rational debate, you cannot be creative. You cannot express your ideas if you're always living in fear. And fear is what we have to live with in this country. So fear of retaliation, not only from the state, but the non-state actors. I mean, in Pakistan, we know a lot about non-state actors. And they sometimes are stronger than the state because they are secretly supported by the state. So this conflict remains. And I think the only defense we have is to try and enlarge the freedom that we have through very careful use of this freedom of expression. Because we cannot totally go and hit the wall. We have to do it carefully, try and build our resources, try and build the kind of opinion that we need, try and strengthen the civil society, and that's how I think we can move forward.
There were two ways of concept of film. One was business, and the other the seventh art. So let's talk about the seventh art. For example, in my country there was a war recently, and a lot of films were shot, both from in the region and worldwide. And here is one theme that I would like to introduce. Behind and above the aesthetics, there is another thing that I think is most important. It's the ethics. The ethics of us authors is on several levels. First of all, between the writer and his work is only the hand. Between him and the painter is only his hand. Between us filmmakers and our work is 50 persons. So you have to have that kind of ethics to respect the other, to influence them and to tell them what is your idea and to share it and to bring them together and not and use force of argument and not argument of force. And this is something which is very, very important, and I think that ethics is something that we are losing. But the other ethics, which for me is more important, is the individual author's ethics. I will give you an example. getting back to those films that were shot concerning the war in my country. There are a lot of films that were shot, and excuse me for my expression, 90% of them are shit. Why? They are not on the level of the chosen theme. If you have a genocide, ethnic cleansing, mass killings, your film has to be on the aesthetical level and on the level of the provoked theme. So, when we are now, I'm getting back to the main theme, the freedom of speech. As far as I'm concerned, seeing those 90% of shit films, those films which are making money are those who are selling the themes, and only the themes, and nothing going profound and analyzing and giving something which is a positive side and trying to analyze. I would like to tell, I saw 25 years ago a short film, 5 minutes. It was in black and white. It's the end of the Second World War. A guy is coming back from, it's the end of the war. He is alone. It is a snow. It's cold. It's freezing. He has a beer something like a week. He is tired. He has a gun. He walks through the snow and gets to the bird, which is freezing. He takes the bird and gives her life. The wing, the other wing, and he throws the bird, and she is going around. He takes his rifle and kills the bird. This film of 5 minutes has so many messages. It is so good for analysis. Who is he? What happened to him? Both sides of the human being, the humanity and the cruelty, the war, why the war, and everything else. 5-minute films. And when you see that, if you want to make a film against war, against and to treat some kind of psychology, human and everything else, you have to do it better. So once again, I'm getting back to that kind of ethics, which I think is the most important thing if we want our films to beat the blockbusters and everything else. By ethics, and the ethics is something which provokes a new aesthetics, a new approach of the themes, and not repeating something which was done 50 years ago. Each war, each conflict, each thing has his particularity. It is different. You cannot generalize everything. So you have to find that approach. Once again, I'm insisting on that ethics. I'm a professor, and believe me, 70% I am trying to teach them aesthetics, but 30% it's ethics, ethics, ethics. And it's on us to have that ethics towards the young generation, to give them the possibility to learn how to watch and how to appreciate films, and what are the values, what is kitsch and what is the real thing, and to make them educated in order, because if we don't have a public, film doesn't exist. We have to have an audience that respects and that can watch our films in order to appreciate them and to beat the other side.
In my opinion, there is a culture of the peace, and there is a culture of the hate. Culture of the peace is tolerance, accept the other, create critical spirits, and most importantly for me, the looking for the truth. The looking for the truth. Opposite the culture of the hate is the fanatism, is the discrimination, fundamentally its objective is the power of a few. In my opinion, culture of the hate has no right. What's the problem? The problem becomes when we confuse tolerance with single thinking, or accept the other with a set of certain social rules, on looking for the truth with religion or political dogmas. This is the problem. This is other side of the culture of the hate. The laws, that control the freedom of expression are, in most cases, food for culture of the hate. Because they confuse sometimes, in an interested way, this concept. This is, for me, very important. Not confuse, and not use the law for a control of thinking.
Hatred, obviously, is a very dangerous beast. As far as the artists are concerned, filmmakers or theater makers, music makers, for them, I mean, they just cannot live on hate. And so all artists, may it be television, filmmakers, or other forms of arts, for them it is their vested interest to fight hate mongers or hate mongering, and that gives them more space to reach out. You see, when hate became so widespread that music concerts stopped, and theater, like folk theater, was literally destroyed because of these hate mongers, religious extremists, and film industry got destroyed partly because they themselves got sort of eaten up by this monster, and the kind of films they were making, they were full of violence and hatred. Even the television industry, which now has been taken over by the private sector, for them, ratings and profit is the god, rather than the information ministry, which used to be the case for Pakistan television. So now you see dramas which are actually catering for hate mongering, and you see certain characters who are now presented as heroes and role models, who are actually projecting a very narrow-minded and very prejudiced and distorted kind of thinking. So you might see them on our screens. So that is another danger, that our filmmakers and television makers, they get involved. What we have learned is that it's always possible to address all these issues and even present different points of views, the hate point of view and the love point of view, the violence point of view and the peace point of view. It's how you address it, how you engage, and one very successful method of doing this is present the human picture, present human stories, the oppression, the suffering caused by hate speech and hate-filled ideologies. For example, one of our plays was based on blasphemy law victims, something which you can't even talk in detail in a private conversation also. But what we did was, we presented the human side. We presented not certain sect, certain religion, certain ideology, certain gender. We just presented human beings. The essence of human beings is good. It is our society which creates these monsters. it is our family system where, or the school system, or the state, the kind of thinking which is projected all around you. So if you disregard that and approach the basic love-filled humanity of human beings and approach them with aesthetics, with ethics, as well as with popular appeal.
So to go back to the beginning, I suppose we actually have no constitutionally guaranteed freedom of speech in Australia. The High Courts have debated this and they've determined that there's an implied right to freedom of speech, but of course this, as far as I'm aware, has never actually been challenged to any great degree. In thinking about it, I suppose for me, the area where what would come closest to hate speech is actually from our politicians. I and the people I mix with seem to feel that there's no representation of our viewpoint in what's currently happening in Australia, and I'm sure that most people are aware of our frightful record on refugees, and also our treatment of our Indigenous people would be perhaps the things that I consider to be the worst situations for us, really tragic ones. And our politicians seem to have very nuanced and elegant ways of polarising debate on this to reflect what they believe to be the opinions of the general public. So we do have these kinds of issues. I guess what I would feel, though, is that in terms of the arts, there are, again, two kinds of levels. Publicly funded broadcasting, I suppose most of the practitioners in our country would be of a liberal kind of persuasion. What we've seen in public broadcasting over the last 10 years is that the content producers are being increasingly narrowed down in terms of funding. Senior bureaucrats of a different kind of mindset are being put in charge. We find rationalisation, dumbing down, and the really challenging kinds of projects that explore these kinds of important issues are being phased out. So this is a form of censorship in a different kind of way, taking a different kind of method. On the other hand, in terms of film production, we're a very small country. Our population, I don't think it's much bigger than Karachi. So obviously we don't produce an enormous number of films, and we also don't have a very large audience for those, as very few of our films do well overseas. So most of our filmmaking, commercial or otherwise, is actually funded by the government. But of course it's under the authority of the Australian, of Screen Australia, which is an organisation of people who are of, filmmaking persuasion. They're usually ex-filmmakers, people with serious experience who go in and out of the industry. So what is interesting about that is that I don't believe that you could ever fund, that you would ever see a film in Australia of the kind that I've sometimes seen coming out of Bollywood that are really very hate-driven, and I could give a few examples, but I'm sure you all know them. Really difficult films for me to watch, certainly, and I believe that we could never see a film come out of that because of this layer in Australia of administrators for film funding that are of a more liberal persuasion. I suppose there are a number of people in Australia who would consider that we've reached the point of too much political correctness, that in fact the arts are too politically correct in terms of actually trying to control this kind of thing. I just also mention Indigenous filmmaking, which I think is incredibly interesting. It's an area that has been worked on very strongly, and I think I mentioned it yesterday. There's been a lot of support given to Indigenous filmmakers, and they've responded really well. 2009, one of them won the Camera d'Or, which was an extraordinary achievement. I think it's only one of the few big awards that we've ever won at Cannes. And I suppose what's interesting there is that there's again been intervention to ensure that Indigenous filmmaking is of a nature that's actually acceptable to Indigenous people. We have a protocol that's something like 50 or 60 pages long, talking about white filmmakers working with Indigenous people, the kind of consultation that needs to take place in order that these kinds of films are satisfactory or that don't offend Indigenous sensibilities. And there are a lot of them, and they're not something that would be immediately apparent to most people unless they've been educated in that way. Of course, we now start at university level. It's something I always teach our young students, is the protocols, try to show them examples of positive and negative representations. So I think that this has been an incredibly positive thing, and it's been a real flourishing for Australian filmmaking that this has happened.
I think it's complex to explain hate, but it's simple to explain love. One famous sentence the Buddha said is, when you unoccupied your heart and then word come in. We were talking about hate after. Love is a part of things that we learn from our family and society. And fortunately, I come from a peace country. Yeah, so it's a strong power. Love is a strong power which can do something we never do. And it's more stronger than other things. And the power of forgiveness is water recovery. It's an important part from love. So I think we filmmakers should share love instead of hate from our concept of making a film.
Freedom of expression in terms of the performing arts in this country, yes, I certainly feel that there is a lot of curtailment of freedom of expression in the arts. As an artist, I feel restricted by it. I myself and a lot of my fellow artists that I know have to apply self-censorship. In fact, that censorship has probably become a part of our thinking process. And yes, there are certain people who have found a way around it through indirect expression, through symbolic expression, through allegorical expression, etc., etc. And there are even some who have dared to express themselves openly despite the restrictions and despite the fear of a backlash. My salutes to them. But that does not mean that freedom of expression exists for the artists in this country. And sometimes, I wonder, okay, I can say this thing allegorically, symbolically, in direct ways, but sometimes I want to express myself realistically. Symbolism, or etc. These are all a question of form. Sometimes I want to choose the form of naturalistic expression, realistic expression. And I want to say what I want to say. And you, as a filmmaker, as a drama maker, you feel restricted because what do you write about? You cannot openly write about man-woman relationships because a true expression of a man-woman relationship is not acceptable. You cannot write about state institutions because you are very strongly curbed, and there can be very dire consequences. You cannot write about religion or ideology or state ideology because you can be misinterpreted. As far as hate, the expression of hate is concerned, I feel that there's a far more tolerance for the expression of hate. And you find this expression being aired, like Shahid Nadeem said, through television channels, through different forms of, and at different levels from different platforms. And I think the reason for that acceptance of hate speeches, acceptance for tolerance of hate speeches is that hate speeches, certainly in our country, and I can say with certainty in other countries also, are mostly directed against minorities. It is a form of hitting out at the minorities, of inciting people's feelings against minorities. I am seldom to come across someone who would indulge in hate speech against a majority, whether it be ethnic majority or religious majority or any other form of majority. It is usually a stick to beat the minorities with. And since it is the minorities, and the minorities, being a minority, have very little power, therefore there is a tolerance and acceptance of hate speeches. I would just give an example. This was in Bhurban. I was shooting a drama, a television serial. Of course, we were accosted by mullahs of the vicinity, etc., all that did happen. But there was a mosque right next to where we were shooting. And the imam of that mosque openly said that a certain sect of Islam, it is in fact incumbent upon Muslims to kill members of that sect, that it is jaiz to kill members of that sect as a Muslim. Now, what I'm saying, and this happens everywhere, all the time. But what is interesting was that this place was within earshot of a cantonment. And there was an army school and another sort of various army institutions around that area. So obviously, it was heard all over. But I marveled at the freedom of speech that Maulvi had to incite people to kill members of a minority community. So, similar things are happening in other parts in India also now. Hate speeches are mainly used against minority communities. So, that is how I see this whole thing.
We have a freedom, but we had how can I say, a bad experience about the last president just expelled by the people with the candle demonstration. You may know that, maybe, yeah, some people know. Yeah, at the time, yeah, there was a very disastrous event as the Sewol ferry, 2014, Sewol ferry, yeah, shipwreck was happened, and then lots of people died. also this disastrous moment just aired on the broadcast. So lots of people shocked, and was a very, and also we asked to the government, what did you do? But they couldn't answer, and they didn't do proper. So lots of filmmakers tried to make about this, but the government tried to blocking their funding, and they made a blacklist about the stop the funding. And yeah, even though the cultural area they did, and also they tried to make all part of the culture and the economy and the other things is not properly going well. So why people demonstrate, expel her. Anyway, right now it's going better, and we try to get the right. And even, in my opinion, even though the system is good, it can be affected by the government or politician. So we have to, keep an eye on the politics and law, and we have to try to find our right. Freedom of expression is one of the most important, even though the commercial films, it can be affected by the money. But independent filmmakers, they can have a right for express theirs. Yeah, so it's one of the most important, and we are trying to find a good result, and we just have getting the lessons about from our history.
On the other hand, the human beings are coming back to the tribal psychology. When I'm talking about tribal, I don't think only about roots, ethnical, but also tribes are supporters of Liverpool against supporters of Chelsea. They are belonging to something which is as small as possible, and not to share the other values. And that's also some kind of projection of the human being, which is also schizophrenic. On one side, they are very peaceful with a lot of love, and on the other hand, hate and ready to kill. The other thing is, they are hiding now, for example, in my country, all the mafia, all the war criminals are in churches, in mosques, in the first rows. They are using that kind of psychology in order to have their own profit. So they are adapted themselves very well to the new conditions and to the new sociology, as I can say. And the other thing which is now something that is happening and which is frightening, Erich Fromm wrote a book, Escape from Freedom. When a human being is close to have a freedom, he is afraid of the freedom, and he escapes from that possibility to be free and wants to have some kind of leader, someone to follow, and not to be the one and unique in the world.